Hussein Askary, welcome to BRI Dialogues.
Thank you very much, Ali. I'm very happy to be with you and with Dr. Ehtishami. It's my pleasure.
Um, a lot of people around the world know of you. For those of our audience who are joining us and hopefully will be pressing subscribe button on BRI Dialogue soon to join our growing audience. Hussein is a Swedish Iraqi citizen born in Baghdad in 1968, well preserved, as you can tell on the screen, looking young and intact. He's a founding board member and vice president of the Belt and Road Institute in Sweden since 2018. The institute was founded to provide objective information and analysis about the Belt and Road Initiative, and that is why we're excited to have him with us. Hussein has a background as an economic and strategic analyst at the International Schiller Institute, which is headquartered in Germany, since 1996, and when the Institute published the first comprehensive economic study of the Eurasian Land-Bridge. It couldn't be more relevant today with, Munich Security Conference in the background as we are talking. And what came to be known as the New Silk Road. Hussein has written books since 1997. His first book was the Eurasian Land-Bridge, New Silk Road, Locomotive for Worldwide Economic Development. And his last two books are a special study on Operation Felix, the reconstruction of Yemen and connection to the Belt and Road, and a republication in Chinese of extending the New Silk Road to West Asia. I'm going to spare you all from all of his, accolades in and around media, and we're going to jump into it. Hussein, I think it would be extremely important to paint the picture, not that a lot of people around the world are not familiar with BRI, but to perhaps unpack where we are, because we're in the second decade of BRI. And this is, if you were to consider it as a newborn, it's an adolescent now, and perhaps maybe a teenager with its own characteristics. Where is BRI going, and how do you assess the gap between the critics around BRI and what really has been delivered on the ground? So let's start there and then come down.
Yeah, thank you for the introduction. Well, the Belt and Road is in its second decade, but also in its second stage of evolution. It's going through an evolutionary process. It's not backsliding. It's not becoming smaller. It's becoming bigger, but more dynamic, more colorful. But the issue we have had, that's why we established the Belt and Road Initiative, is that most people don't understand it. And there's a massive attack on it by Western think tanks, media, and governments to vilify and paint it as a bad Chinese geopolitical instrument. And I advise everybody to actually go to and read the original documents, the reports by China and its partners in the Belt and Road. Isn't it fascinating that the more the Belt and Road is attacked in the West, the more nations join it in the global South? That's a paradox. So people have to ask the question, why is it so popular then, if all what the Western media and politicians are saying about the Belt and Road? So the Belt and Road Initiative for us is history's largest, greatest development project. It's not about trade. Trade is there, but it's a development project. The economic belt of the Silk Road is to build development corridors for all the nations involved. And it's not limited to the Silk Road. It's all inclusive. Everybody's welcome into that. But because of the geography, the Eurasian geography is the connectivities along the old ancient Silk Road. And then we have, of course, the maritime Silk Road, which is more about trade on the seas, but also it has many developmental aspects. I would advise people to go back and study a document which is called Vision and Action on Jointly Building the Silk Road Economic Belt and 21st Century Maritime Silk Road. It was published in March 2015, and it's issued by the National Development and Reform Commission at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Ministry of Commerce of the People's Republic of China. That document includes all you need to understand about the philosophy, the idea, and the plan behind the Belt and Road Initiative. It's quite a comprehensive plan. It also includes what the main corridors of the Belt and Road, but it's not limited to that. That's why the Chinese government never publishes maps of the Silk Road. All the maps you see about the Silk Road are different people with different interpretations. We have established our map, which is animated based on this document. But also we added our own history, our own knowledge about the importance of infrastructure connectivity along Eurasia, Africa, and the world. Now, the Belt and Road Initiative consists of 5 important principles, which people always have to remember. It's like policy coordination, which is development policy coordination, to align China's policies with those who want to become members. What do we want to build together? What is beneficial for our economies? 2 is the importance of connectivity, building physical infrastructure, which is very, very important if you want to develop. You need transport, water, power, education, healthcare, and so on and so forth. The 3rd is the financial integration. How do we finance all these together? It's not that China does not impose any ideas on any nation. China says, okay, what do you have on your national program for development? Let's take a look at it. Does it align with our idea? Okay, you have this railway project, you have this road project, you have this hydropower plant. Oh, that's good. Let's work on that. But it's your plans. So this is how the coordination works. Then we have the unimpeded trade, that trade should flow freely among the members of the Belt and Road. And 5, which is very important, is people-to-people connectivity. It's cultural integration of nations. Not integration, but communication among a dialogue of cultures, which should be the ultimate, and this is the idea, is that you can achieve peace through economic development. And it is an extension of China's own economic miracle, because China implemented this at home. It's not selling its model of communism, but it's the idea how a poor nation can develop rapidly. What do you need? And these development corridors exist in China. You have the Yangtze River Corridor, you have the Pearl River Corridor, now it's called the Greater Bay Area Corridor, and the Beijing-Tianjin Corridor. These are corridors which people need to study to understand how it transformed the areas through which this corridor goes in China. So you can see how it will transform Central Asia, West Asia, or the Middle East, or African nations. So these are very important things to understand, but also there's a philosophical difference. That's why people in Western powers today don't understand China's policy. It's based on a philosophy of win-win. It's not a trick, it's not a rhetoric, it's a philosophy, it's a belief, it's a practice that the best way to develop yourself is to have common development for everyone. It's like, to put it simply, you will do better if your customers are rich. If your neighbor is rich, you will do better. And that's what President Xi Jinping said in 2023 at the Third Belt and Road, the 10th anniversary, which I and my colleagues attended in Beijing, the 10th anniversary of the announcement of the Belt and Road Initiative, where he said, China will only do well when the world is doing well. And when China does well, the world will do even better. So this is something the Chinese believe in, is common prosperity for everyone is possible, it's beneficial. In the West, we have the imperialist, colonialist zero-sum game, that the world is a war of everyone against everyone around limited resources. If somebody wins, somebody loses. That's life. And this is the problem today with politics in the United States and in the EU and NATO countries, is that, might makes right. If you are powerful, you dominate, you win. The others are losers. You can take over other countries, you can subjugate other countries. This has been going on for 500 years, but now things are turning around. And this is thanks to the rise of the Global South, but China is in the spearhead of that development. The Belt and Road is a vehicle, the emergence of the BRICS, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and so on. It's turning the table around on this 500 years of this zero-sum game geopolitical madness, which is leading us now to total confrontation and probably thermonuclear annihilation of all human civilization.
Thank you, Hussein, for that really comprehensive and interesting analysis and summary of the world we find ourselves. We accept fully that that geopolitics of the world is shifting very dramatically. Singapore's prime minister identified this 2 decades ago as the Asian century, and we're seeing it, and it's pivoting around China. But there are three or four issues that are constantly reflected upon. One is that if you look at China's investment BRI, and Fudan, as you know, does produce a fantastic report on the projects and also on the investments, post-COVID, there's a dramatic drop in this. Now, some explain that as China's disinterest, and others say because it's actually capacity building. So it'd be really good to have your feedback on that one. The second is that, well, this is a Marshall Plan on steroids, that is about development and so on, but nevertheless, it pivots around China. So is it about the world, or is it about the grandeur of China? The second. Sorry, Hossein, I'm going to give you the third one as well,
Okay.
which is about financing of this, that either China does it or China indebts its BRI partners to secure financing. And so, these criticisms are frequent in the media that you've already alluded to. So could you put some of these issues on the table and kind of explore them with us, please, from your expert point of view?
Yeah, the issue, I mean, people forgot what COVID was about. The world was shut down.
Yeah.
Many nations were completely shut down. Economic activity, came to a halt in many, many countries. And that affected projects, and the Chinese were very strong and sometimes extreme in abiding by the restrictions, lockdowns, and so on. And that affected even their companies abroad.
Right.
So in the Belt and Road regions, the nations were hit by the economic consequences of COVID, besides the practical consequences. So China did not want to stop. I mean, this was a pandemic. This was a horrific experience for the whole world. But then what happened there is we had an economic collapse of many nations, financial collapse of many nations who could not bear the consequences and the price of the COVID-19. So many nations started to unprioritize projects because of the financial crisis created by the COVID. Chinese companies could not anymore, get involved in new projects. But all these things were reversed after the COVID restrictions were lifted. And it's not true that Chinese companies are not, and China is not giving loans to infrastructure projects. There are many infrastructure projects relaunched. We have also nations taking their own initiative, like we have, the Laos, the China-Laos high-speed rail was built under COVID. It was completed after COVID. But now Vietnam and Thailand, both of them have decided last year that they want to build high-speed railway and connect to the Chinese and to their neighboring in Southeast Asia countries. And these are financed jointly by China and these countries. We have many power projects, hydropower projects in Africa being financed now by China and by these nations jointly. What happened is that many nations, because of the financial crisis, I wrote a lot about this, they were coerced by the International Monetary Fund and World Bank and the EU and the United States to divest from investments in large-scale infrastructure, especially with China, so that they can get financial help. Nations were in dire, like Zambia, many other countries. I wrote a long article about Zambia's financial crisis, Sri Lanka. They were told by the IMF, if you want to get help, stop borrowing money from China to build infrastructure. So they were threatened. So China cannot keep those nations on life support all nations of the global South. It's trying to fill the gaps which President Xi Jinping talked about, the bottlenecks of development, which is the lack of infrastructure, lack of capital, and lack of skilled labor. And China has been trying to do that. So many nations chose not to work with China. As I told you in the beginning, China does not tell nations, we want you to build this project and we will give you money to build it and we will finance it. We will build the project physically. No, these nations go to China and say, okay, we have this list of projects we need for our own development. What do you think? How can we work together? This is the spirit of the Belt and Road. But many nations decided not to pursue some of the development projects. Some nations like Malaysia, they had to review their projects like the East Link railway project, which was reduced from $17 billion to $11 billion because there was a huge financial crisis in Malaysia. It was not created by China. The Chinese government, Mahathir bin Mohamad, went to China and said, look, we need to review this project because we cannot afford it. We also want Malaysian companies to be involved in the project. And the Chinese said, no problem. It's like the Chinese are very flexible. So there has not been a backslide on the intensity of but many nations went through financial crisis. Then we had the Ukraine war. Many nations in the global South were hit badly by a food crisis, but also by a financial crisis. And also the United States, through the Inflation Reduction Act, the price of dollar went through the roof. And many nations who are already in financial problems, who have debt to Western institutions, not to China, and this is something we can discuss because I did a lot of research on the debt trap narrative, which is not true. I'm writing a whole book about it. But many nations had to pay double or triple in interest rate and for their loans from bondholders in the West, because all their debt is denominated in dollar, including the debt to China. But China's share of the debt of these nations, I studied Sri Lanka, Zambia, Kenya, Pakistan, and Montenegro. The Chinese share in all these countries is no more than 15% of all debt they have. 85% of the debt these nations have, which are very famous in the debt trap narrative, is owed to Western institutions at much higher interest rates and shorter maturity than the Chinese loans. Chinese loans are often 25 to 30 years long in maturity, which means you have all these years to pay it back. You have also grace periods of 4 to 6 years where you pay nothing, because these projects have to give back to economy before you start, reimbursement of the loans paid. So so many nations got hit by a deep financial crisis, and therefore they stopped negotiating for building infrastructure projects along the Belt and Road Initiative. Now we have a new stage in the Belt and Road, which is industrialization and modernization, where nations in Africa, Latin America, West Asia are saying, look, we are no longer going to export oil, minerals, very cheap, and then we import all these things, finished products, very expensive. We want to build industries in our countries. So the added value, part of it comes back to our economy, not to these other industrialized nations. And China is very open to this. The relocation of many industries now taking place in West Asia, in Africa. Industrial parks are opening up and popping up all over these regions, where you have electronics, textiles, even electric vehicles, electric buses. You have buses in London now, electric buses, double deckers. They are built in Egypt through Chinese companies. So this is the value chains are spread all over the planet now and the global South through Chinese investments.
Right.
So this is the new stage in the evolution of the Belt and Road. But there is still infrastructure projects being financed and built, but more cautiously. And many nations are trying to get their own financing instead of taking loans. They're trying to mobilize and pool national resources to pay for their dams. One fantastic example of this shift in the world is that in Tanzania, the Julius Nyerere hydropower plant, a dam, all Western companies refused to build it and or finance it. The Tanzanian government, they made sure they get the money themselves. They raised the money with also with the help of the African development. But the ones who built the project were an Egyptian company. Two Egyptian companies built the dam and all the electric transmission. The turbines in the dam, which produced 2,000 megawatts of power, which is big, were bought from China. But everything else was financed domestically in Africa. It was built by African companies. So this is an evolution in the whole process of economic development. But the Belt and Road has been a key element in this.
Yeah. Hussein, on the financing side, there are also views that if a country cannot afford to pay the loans back, China will take its share through barter, through acquisition of minerals, strategic assets, so-called. How credible is this argument? And if it is the case, how much does that affect China's trade relationships with the BRI partners?
Okay, well, there is not a single case where a contract with China stipulates that China will take over anything in that country if that country fails to pay. Actually, in many of these projects, if you look at it as a business, China is the loser. It's like China is providing loans like the highway in Montenegro for 2% interest rate over 20 years with a 5-6 year grace period. It's like no company in the world will sign such a contract. But the Chinese know these are important for the economic development of those countries who are China's trade partners. So China is actually supporting these countries so there are no cases. Even the Sri Lanka Hambantota port, which has been used as the template, part of my book is based on that because that was concocted in the US State Department in cooperation with the Harvard University Kennedy School Belfer Center. And Graham Ellison, of the fame of the Thucydides trap, he advised the students who wrote that report for the State Department. It was ordered by the State Department from that center. And then the State Department took that report and sent it all over the world to the media. And I traced that. It's like an investigative report. I'm going to include it in my book. But that was concocted. And they said, we're going to use the Sri Lanka Hambantota port as a template, as the main example of how China gives loans to countries in return for controlling their assets. Now, the Hambantota case itself is a perfect example how China has helped those countries get out of a debt trap set up by Western institutions. What happened in 2016, 2017 is that Sri Lanka was in a deep financial crisis. So they were removed as a low-income country by the IMF, which means that you cannot get concessional loans from multilateral institutions. So you have to go to the market. So they had to go to the bond markets, private bond markets, where BlackRock, Ashmore, Aberdeen, all these private investment funds loan money to countries at very high interest rate for a short period of time. And Sri Lanka was forced to go there. In the meantime, this port was being built through a loan by the China Exim Bank, Export-Import Bank. And Dr. Deborah Brautigam from the Johns Hopkins University, she did a fantastic study. She went to Sri Lanka. She got all the documents about this. And what she discovered is that what happened is that the Sri Lankan government offered the Hambantota port for lease to anybody, Japan, the United States. And by the way, the Hambantota port was proposed by a Canadian and Danish consulting companies who did a job for the Sri Lankan government. And they encouraged everybody to invest in it because this is a promising future project. But what happened is that everybody refused to help Sri Lanka. And the Chinese came in to help Sri Lanka to pay back debt is about $700 million, which was due in 2017 to Western financial institutions. So China bailed out Sri Lanka and accepted the lease on the port as a payback. So Sri Lanka went to the whole world and said, look, we are going bankrupt. We're going to default. We need $700 million to pay our debt to these Western vultures. And nobody wanted to help. China went to help them. So China actually helped Sri Lanka pay its debt through the Hambantota port lease. So you see the contradiction, but it has become so dominant, it is impossible to erase from the mind of people. I mean, Chinese loans to Sri Lanka constituted in 2022, when I did my study, only 10% of all Sri Lanka's foreign debt. 90% of Sri Lanka's debt was to 45% to Western private funds, World Bank and IMF, and the Asian Development Bank, which is controlled in Japan, the rest. So China had only 10% of Sri Lanka's debt, but everybody was focusing on China's share instead of these others who have been looting Sri Lanka for many years. So it's a story of narrative. Sri Lanka is back now working with China. I mean, China is developing the Colombo port. It is very, very important both for the whole Indian Ocean, but especially to India. The Colombo port is now becoming a major, but the Hambantota port is also becoming an active part of the whole, supply chains along in the Indian Ocean. So these are this is where the contradictions come when you don't look at the details and you focus on the narrative, and you don't know where the narrative comes from. You fall into that. Now there's a question of this Marshall Plan or not Marshall Plan. This is not a Marshall Plan because China is not seeking political influence over nations. The Marshall Plan was not a bad idea. If we look at the economics of it, it was important. But to use it as part of a Cold War, ideological war, I mean, China is begging other nations, please don't copy our political system. Our political system fits only China because it fits our history, our social structures, our economic structures. Don't try to copy our model, please. So China is not trying to extract political concessions from nations. Of course, it wants peaceful coexistence. It wants respect from these nations for its territorial integrity. China expects nations to stand with China at the United Nations to defend the one state, the one China policy concerning Taiwan. They want to respect the internal affairs of China when it comes to Xinjiang and Tibet. These are legitimate interests for China, and they expect their partners to respect these in accordance with the United Nations Charter. So this is not like the Marshall Plan. China is trying to pay countries to support it. China is building what I told you, a win-win policy where you make your neighbors, you make your customers more prosperous. It's a fantastic business model.
Hussein, thank you very much for that. I want to take the conversation a bit towards your own experience and Iraq oil fund. What's happening to Venezuela now and the management of resources, which is a nice segue to Anush's good question about debt trap diplomacy and all of that. And as well with the brewing tensions in Persian Gulf and God forbid yet another crisis over there, there are some headlines, analysis, and commentary that one of the conditions that America may stipulate on Iran as a part of a final deal is to curtail or to minimize or to fully cut exports of oils to China, as far-fetched as that may sound to imagine. But we live in crazy times. So why don't you take us a little bit about the history of resource, I would say, management in a post-crisis, and how will all of this fit into the BRI and the Middle Corridor? Is this far bigger than just Iran and its nuclear program? Is this part of the choke points, whether it's Chansey port and, whether it's Strait of Hormuz, and what next?
Yeah, I think it's very obvious from the U.S. National Security Strategy 2025 is that China and the Belt and Road, I mean, China's developments and economic development is not stoppable. And even the document says that China's trade with the poorest countries of the world is now larger than China's trade with the United States. So China will focus only on the Western Hemisphere, make sure that China and Russia don't have any influence there, but also West Asia or the Middle East is a very important choke point and strategic area for US influence to encounter China and Russia and other nations. Now, this is we have the example of the when the United States took over, the kidnapped the president of Venezuela, and then the president announced that all oil money from Venezuela will be managed by the United States in a special account, but this time it's in Qatar. So there's no oversight from Congress or anybody. It will be managed by the president, who is the worst businessman on the planet. But we don't know how that will be managed. But we have a precedent to this policy, although in a different manner. When the United States invaded Iraq illegally in 2003, Iraq became an occupied country, and in international law, the occupation force, which is the United States, Britain, Australia, I should add, the coalition administration, they became the government of Iraq as a legitimate, formally de jure government of Iraq. So the United Nations had to adjust to that reality. So in May 22, 2003, the UN Security Council issued a resolution 1483, which included many issues, because if you remember, Iraq was under economic blockade, sanctions since Iraq invaded Kuwait in 1991. No, 1990, but 1991 was the war. And these were very harsh economic sanctions and blockade. Everybody remembers when Madeleine Albright was asked that 500,000 Iraqi children died as a result of this policy. She said it's a good price to keep control of Saddam Hussein. So under these sanctions, Iraq was only allowed to sell a small portion of its oil to buy food, only food. It's called Oil for Food program. In 2003, the United Nations abolished that Oil for Food fund and created the Development Fund for Iraq to rebuild Iraq. And Iraq was allowed to sell as much oil as it could to start the reconstruction of Iraq. And on that same day, 22nd of May, 2003, when the United Nations issued that resolution, which said that this fund will be under the Iraqi Central Bank, the US President, George W. Bush, signed Executive Order 13303 in the afternoon of the same day, which is called, it's under national security provisions, the protection of the Iraqi Development Fund and other assets in which Iraq has interest. So that fund became practically under all Iraqi oil money will be under American president. The coalition administration under Paul Bremer, who was now the governor of Iraq, decided that the bank account where the money will be deposited will not be in Baghdad in the central bank, but it will be, or any other Iraqi bank, but it will be in the Federal Reserve of New York branch. So all Iraqi exports from that day to this day, and even when China buys 1 million barrels of oil from Iraq, it doesn't pay the money to an Iraqi bank, but to the Federal Reserve. It's formally an Iraqi bank account in an American bank, but the American president controls it under this executive order. And every year in May, the American president renews that executive order under national security provisions. So through control of that money, the United States controls politics in Iraq. Although formally the occupation ended in 2009, they signed a comprehensive, and American forces in Iraq are training the Iraqi military, although they did a lousy job to stop ISIS in 2014. They fled in 1.5 hours after many years of training by the U.S. forces. So the United States controlled politics. Like last 2-3 weeks ago, Iraq had elections in October last year to form a new government. Now the Shia coalition group of parties, they won a landslide actually, and they are the ones who are assigned, according to Iraqi constitution, to choose the prime minister,
Right.
which is usual in democracies. Now, President Trump issued a statement saying that I don't want Nouri al-Maliki to become prime minister.
Yeah.
Otherwise, we will stop helping Iraq.
Yeah.
So it's that the American president wants to decide who becomes the prime minister of Iraq. And we know Trump a few years ago threatened to take over all the Iraqi money in the Federal Reserve Bank. So this is the way the United States control, because every month the Iraqis send a bill to the U.S. Treasury, Department of Treasury, asking for money to spend that month. And then the United States looks at the bill and say, okay, we like this one, we don't like this one, we like this one. And then they ship the dollar in cash in military airplanes to the Baghdad airport every month. Yeah. So the Iraqis every month are waiting for the cash to come from the United States. And because Iraq's economy was destroyed and never rebuilt in the past 22 years, 23 years now, Iraq is completely dependent on getting that cash to buy food, clothing, even fuel, although it exports a lot of oil, but we import fuel because we don't have enough refining capacity. Everything, medicine, is dependent on that money coming that month. Because of the destruction of the Iraqi economy, what the government has done is employs people by the millions in government jobs where they produce nothing. They do nothing. But what happens is that you get a salary at the end of the month. So more than half of the Iraqi population lives off that money coming every month. And imagine if the United States said, oh, there is no money this month. You didn't listen to us. So everybody now is freaking out in Iraq, and the elites, and they're telling Nouri al-Maliki, please, please step down. Don't try to become prime minister because we will starve. And I see this every day in debates in Iraq where everybody's trying to convince Nouri al-Maliki, please listen to Trump. Let's find someone else as prime minister because we will be punished. We don't want to go back to the 1990s where children in Iraq were dying of malnutrition. So this is the way cynical politics works here. And there is very little the Iraqis can do in this situation unless they want to get into a big fight with the United States.
Although
so this is what to expect in Venezuela.
Right. Although, you know, given that Maliki is so close to Tehran, might have something to do with the calculations. And also, just as a side, when he was prime minister, I don't think there was much to clap about either. But putting him aside for a moment, and yet, and everything you say is absolutely so, and yet China is the biggest player in Iraq's energy market. So how is Iraq managing this quandary? And why is Trump picking on Iran to sever its energy links with China and is silent on Iraq? I mean, Ali and I are really confused by this.
Yeah, this is a very good.
Yeah, tell us.
Yeah, I think in science, you can make a discovery when you find an anomaly, a paradox, where things don't make sense, you know, where you make the experiment and you expect a result and you don't get that result. There is a paradox, and that's where you make a discovery. And the discovery here is that the United States, as we saw in Venezuela recently, is not interested in production. It's not interested in physical investment, in discovering oil, pumping the oil, shipping the oil. It's interested in the money now. Historically, Iraq, I mean, the whole Gulf, and even more emphatically in the last 20 years, almost all oil and gas from the region goes to the east. China, Japan, Korea, India, and the Southeast Asian countries. And when the United States occupied Iraq, you know, everybody said, oh, the United States occupied Iraq to take the oil. Sorry, no, they're not interested in producing oil. All the American companies who went to Iraq They withdrew after a short while. Why? Because in Iraqi constitution, the oil belongs to the people. So foreign companies are not allowed to own oil fields. What foreign companies are offered is a license to explore and produce oil through contract. So they get a royalty for each barrel produced. They get 1%, 2%. Now, American oil companies are not interested in 1%, 2%. They're interested in 50%, like the British oil company in Iraq and Iran. They were taking 75% and giving the Iranian and Iraqi people 15% or 25%. That's what foreign oil companies from the West want. So what happened is that American oil companies and British, Shell, the Royal Dutch Shell, they withdrew from Iraq and therefore opened the way for Chinese companies, Malaysian companies, and Russian companies who had also contracts from before, from Saddam Hussein's time. But the ones who have developed Iraq's oil production are Chinese and Russian companies and Malaysian companies, not American or British companies. So because this is the reality of Western economics. They cannot build things anymore. They cannot produce. They want money. And the United States, instead of producing the oil, it's taking the money from the oil and using it as a weapon against others. But it also uses the strategic choke point as a blackmail against Asia, especially China. Because if you close the Hormuz Strait, in the case of war, God forbid, the oil would, it's China and Japan and South Korea and India who will be affected immediately, physically. But the effect of that will crash the whole international financial and banking system in the West, which is most vulnerable to such events. So it will be a total collapse. But that's where the paradox is. The United States cannot and does not want to have the oil, but it wants to prevent others through strategic denial from getting that oil. And that's why they are putting pressure on Iran, because Iran's largest customer is China. But like in areas where the United States can no longer affect policies, like in Central Asia, now everybody in the 90s was saying, oh, the Central Asian countries, they should work with the West, with Europe. We will pump the oil and gas and ship it to Europe, and you'll become free from China and Russia. Well, that didn't happen. Most of this natural gas from Turkmenistan goes to China through pipelines built by China. More and more, even from Kazakhstan, will go to China. It's a stable, nearby market and a growing market. So there's a physical reality which Western politicians don't want to be involved in, but they want to control it from the outside by geopolitical games, by using military force, using destabilization, regime change, and financial control and sanctions, which are a type of war. Economic sanctions is a war, a form of war against nations. And sometimes it's more devastating, as we saw in Iraq, than direct war. So this is the situation. So the paradox of Iraqi oil is very, very useful for people to study, also to study the economic decline of the West.
Hussein, thank you very much for that. I have two questions. One is our standard question for bringing the program to the end, but one before that. I couldn't let go with everything that is happening in Munich today and northern sea route and China considering itself near Arctic and the new fleet that it's building and calling them snow dragons. One would think in a climate change scenario and the pressures on global economic trajectory, a shorter route that uses less marine fuel and less emissions and cheaper supply chains, even for Europe, would be of interest through Rotterdam and China. And I'm not talking about Berlin-Baghdad railway, and these corridors have been tried in the past. But even from a security architecture, there was a beautiful article today in Financial Times that even experts are saying China could not be a credible threat to United States through Arctic. Again, is this as well part of preventing China to have a better foothold into European economy, whether there's BYD double-decker buses, etc.? How does the Arctic or near Arctic power ambitions of China fit into BRI? And my closing question for you is that what is Hussein Askary's single most piece of important advice to xenophobes and xenophiles?
Okay. Thank you. Well, concerning the northern route and the ice Silk Road and all these things and what's going on in the Arctic, in Greenland, I mean, people are mixing apples and oranges. I mean, the trade routes, let's talk about the trade routes. Who are they servicing? It's not only China, they are servicing the European economies. You know, when the Ukraine war broke out, everybody in the West was saying the China-EU railway, which goes through Russia and Belarus, is finished. And I was contacted by consulting companies who were very worried. They had a lot of customers who ship on that route in Europe and in China. And I did a study for 3 weeks and I looked at all aspects of that. And I said, don't worry, the route will continue because the EU needs that route more than China. Because many companies here were shut down, like car industry here in Sweden, because they could not get the material they need from China when COVID broke out and the railways were shut down. So it's an existential matter for Europe to continue having trade with China. So whatever makes that trade easier is actually in the benefit of Western Europe or the EU. And so that's one thing. It's an apple. The orange is there are strategic matters. There is the exploration for raw materials in the Arctic, which is not explored. All speculation is that there are enormous oil and hydrocarbons, minerals everywhere in the Arctic region beneath the sea. This is one issue everybody is fighting over. The other issue is military strategy. It's like this whole Greenland thing is because the United States wants to place its missile system, the so-called Golden Dome, and that system has been proven to be completely wrong, useless. You cannot shoot down hypersonic missiles with missiles. It's not going to work. So this whole is an illusion, but it serves the military-industrial complex very well. They have enormous resources invested in the military-industrial complex. And that also, the threat of China in the Arctic is used here in the West also to service the military-industrial complex. Swedish JAS Gripen airplanes will be placed on island. We heard in the news yesterday, we will produce all kinds of things for the Arctic region, for Greenland, for Iceland, for all these things. It's the military-industrial complex talking. But the real Swedish companies, they need fast and smooth routes of trade with China because a lot of our, not only consumption, but our industrial production depends on inputs from China. High quality, low price input goods. I mean, there are studies here I have read that how beneficial that is for Swedish industry because the added value is enormous for the Swedish industries. To get these things cheap from China, but also they are very high quality. So there's where we have this mixing of apples and oranges, and this is where this win-win. Like China's strategy and philosophy in the Arctic is it's like the Arctic is like the great oceans. Nobody controls them. It's a matter of exploration, like space. You cannot tell China you are not allowed to go into the moon, because we have a flag there. Now China goes there and says, oh, we can also have a flag there. And Russia has a flag there. The space, the oceans, and these is a matter of exploration. It's not owned by anyone. What is important is to have agreements among nations to regulate that kind of activity in the Arctic or in the oceans or in space, so we don't get into misuse or conflicts on these areas. And the problem now is diplomacy in the West has died. The EU, they say, we don't want to talk to Russia. So how are you going to solve the problem with Russia if you don't talk to each other? Diplomacy is not among friends. Diplomacy is more among rivals and enemies. If you have friends, you don't need diplomacy. So we have thrown diplomacy out of the window. The United States says, peace through strength, might makes right. We dominate, we solve problems by telling everybody what to do. Otherwise, we will bomb them. It's not going to work. So this is the real issue here, and that nations have to go back to diplomacy. We need to have a unified idea about how are you going to utilize our planet, our space, our solar system. I don't believe in limited resources. This is another question. I mean, we create resources, but the whole universe is our field of economic sphere. We can have another interview about that. But this is how the Chinese see it, is that there are no limits for cooperation. There are no limits for economic development, but we have to regulate it so we don't end up in conflict. And diplomacy is very, very important. And it's unfortunate that the Munich Security Dialogue Forum has become a warmongering forum instead of being a place where nations meet and have a serious discussion about the security issues of the world. And if Russia is not invited, then something big is missing. It doesn't make sense to have the Munich Forum, or Iran is not invited. So because these nations exist, they are important, even in military terms. So this is what the whole thing. Now, your question about China and advice to people. I mean, it depends on which part of the world people are. I mean, if you have people in Iraq or
No,
Africa,
just a one-liner as a piece of advice, very briefly, to cinephobes and cinephiles. Just like if you were to leave them with one sentence, what would it be?
Yeah, you get a passport and travel to China.
Hey, yeah.
Travel. That's the best way to understand how China and the Chinese people are doing.
Yeah. Perfect note on which to end, Hussein. Thank you very much. By the way, you mentioned in Sweden, I was chuckling because, of course, Volvo directly depends on China for its future, and that's a very important line to put in there.
Yeah, Geely, Chinese company Geely, owns now the major part of the Volvo automobiles, the cars.
I know
not
that's
the trucks.
no, that's what I'm
And it
saying.
has helped Volvo grow in
Yeah.
China and in the world. And it has helped now, is helping Volvo to get into the electric vehicle world where German brands are in big trouble.
Yeah. Yeah. So that, I mean, that's absolutely, so the Swedish-Chinese connection through Central Europe becomes really vital in that context. Also, I very much enjoyed your comment about outer space, because I much rather we leave the Arctic and Antarctica alone and go beyond it, because we've got so many other species who depend on the tranquility of these two poles of our planet. So I hope our viewers take that to heart and go beyond our planet, which is already dying thanks to our activities here. But I have to tell you, I really enjoyed listening to your discussion of the BRI and your worldview in terms of how things are changing. As you say, there is a lot to unpack still in that. So there is every opportunity for us to have you back to discuss these. For the benefit of our viewers, we had 20 plus questions to discuss with Hussein on the basis of his extraordinary expertise and knowledge. And we've only just touched the surface, Hussein. So it'll be wonderful to have you as our guest to discuss the multitude of issues that you've pointed to, and also the range of questions that we still like to explore with you later. So thank you very much indeed for being our guest today.
Thank you very much. It's my honor to be on your platform. And we both, the Belt and Road Institute in Sweden, and your institute, we working on the same theme, BRI. So we should work more closer together. And it's my pleasure.
Thank you,
Thank
Hussein,
you.
for being with us. Have a good day.